Greetings and welcome back. I am exceptionally pleased to be joined by a very, very rarely seen servant. His name is Teal there. And we're going to be talking about the interesting question of whether or not people have a right to exist, countries, nations, and all of the things related to that. Now, I have some pretty distinct ideas about that, and I think I will introduce the topic with my ideas, and I imagine we can proceed from there. What do you think?
Well, it would be helpful because you know more about the historical use of the term than I do, so that might...
Well, it's more historical observation, but I'll say the following. That if you look at history, the idea of some inherent right to exist, there's a group of people, right? This is mythology. For example, historically, did the English nation before 1066 have a right to exist inherently? And was this right to exist lost when the Normans conquered it and fundamentally changed the cultural bedrock and lay of the land? Well, I would say no. Throughout history, we can observe that, the nation state is a relatively new phenomenon, but sort of people, kingdoms, did not have an inherent right to exist, but instead had to defend themselves. And in turn, when they wished to expand their nationhood, as it were, they engaged in warfare and conflict. This reminds me of something that an ex-CIA operative, Michael Shermer, he used to work on the Osama bin Laden unit in the 90s, said when he was sort of questioned, to put it mildly, by an Israeli lobbyist about Israel's inherent right to exist, and he pointed out the same thing, that countries don't have a right to exist. They can defend themselves, but nothing ever had a right to exist. Otherwise, they wouldn't just go extinct. And the same can be said of countries and nations. And as much as they need to expand, or they feel they need to expand, they will. And somebody suffers for that, and then the person who suffers, or the group of people who suffers, they can cease to exist. I think based on just the way the world works, this notion of a right to exist is silly. We can talk about defense, and even just defense, but these are separate questions. Anyway, that's what I have to say at the beginning about that.
Oh, that's completely fine. And yeah, I would agree that throughout most of history, it has been, we've never had the idea that, yes, this group of people or this identity or anything like that has a right to exist. It's just my interests supersede your interests because some inflated reason, and therefore I'm going to kill you and take all your stuff. And this is something which I've sort of found quite interesting now, because obviously we're going into a state in the world now where we're simply not as violent anymore. I don't want to say...
For now, we're not, yes.
For now, yes. I don't want to say, not as violent as, the West engaged in however many thousand bombing runs in places like the Middle East and vice versa and whatnot. There's still a good amount of violence there, but we're not sort of as locally violent anymore. It always seems to be further and further and further away, because we seem to be forming more and more alliances with people closer to us. It's like, Britain and France throughout most of history, we hate each other.
Well, even more locally, maybe you're stuck in a long queue at the supermarket. Thousands of years ago, if there had been an equivalent, you might have just, butchered the guy in front of you and cut to the front. That's probably hyperbolic, but the point is perhaps taken that, in our dealings with people, we try to look for more peaceful means.
Consider. I don't know how much of a myth that it is, a historical myth. But the idea of certain sports games, I can't remember if it was football or rugby, but it used to, in Britain, basically just be more like a town against another town, and you would literally just basically go, and it would be more of a brawl than anything else. But now it's become more refined. There are more rules in place, and it's simply not as violent now as it was back then. I mean, you can still see the sort of you can still see like rivalries between people like that, but they're generally more peaceful. It might involve just a little bit of shouting or chanting or something like that, but it stops there. You know, there's not as much, lobbing of rocks and stuff anymore.
You do see, particularly in the UK, some sort of last remainders of this in sort of football hooliganism every now and then, but it is pretty minimal, obviously. But I think the point being made here in general is that we've sort of established different rules of etiquette, for how we interact with people.
So
at the level of the nation state.
Yeah. So as sort of a result of that, we seem to be having less and less violent confrontations, and like violence is generally now seen as a less and less acceptable response, or even a less and less acceptable initiation of anything like that. So it seems now that we have the idea of right to exist coming up more and more, because we can't simply just go and steamroll a country that we want anymore, because loads of other people are going to say, excuse me, WTF, and they're going to get involved as well. I mean, the entirety of World War I and II, kind of. It just doesn't go down very well anymore. So when it comes to like right to exist for states and whatnot, historically we don't really have any precedent for it, but now we kind of do. And I think in some ways that's sort of come about as kind of an arms race almost. It's like we've sort of reached a point now where the initiation of violence is just too damn costly to get involved in it.
And what we did, as in people did, to compensate historically within the framework of the nation states, it's a young thing, was to create borders, regulations on immigration, who could immigrate and who could not. And put numbers on that as well. Only a certain number of people in a certain year, and these were ways to mitigate, if not outright avoid, violent conflict, and they worked pretty decently up until fairly recently. But this is really what we're getting at, I suppose, that in Europe we have this problem where I'm not endorsing this, but we're not allowed to use violence. We, as in the people, the state. And there's not really, well, some people do, but in the mainstream view is that immigration should be fairly unlimited and just kind of whatever, just anyone can come.
Yeah, and this then sort of leads on to what I really want to get into, and that is like the right to exist of a people. Because obviously historically the term has been used about states and the concept of this area of land under X number of people's power and control. That if people are willing to then voluntarily give up a little bit of themselves for some perceived greater good, then they have a right to do that, and that becomes an area of land known as some sort of state or city or something like that. But now what we're seeing is this argument of a people's right to exist, and it's something which I see people in the alt-right bringing up quite a lot, and I've noticed like one of their propositions to sort of deal with this is the concept of things like ethno-states, which is then sort of, well, does a people have a right to exist? Does a certain genetic population have some sort of inherent right to just to be?
Well, I mean, once again, inherent, I think the answer is clear, no, because, if populations had an inherent right to exist, then, well, Neanderthals would still be around as an example of a population, a human population that's not Homo sapiens. So exist various populations in history. The original Carthaginians would still be around, but they're not anymore. So, I mean, inherent right, no. But the problem with that is that, at least on the left, which is basically the mainstream, there's the argument that indigenous people have a kind of inherent right. Well, yeah, they have an inherent right to exist. It's very common in Canada and in Australia to talk about the rights of indigenous people. Okay. But if Europeans, for example, are, for better or worse, indigenous in some shape or form to Europe, and let's take an example of Great Britain, that British people, I mean, there's some variation there, but are largely indigenous to the Isles in terms of their stock. Why do they not have the same quote-unquote inherent right as Australian Aboriginals or some indigenous tribe in the Northwestern Territories or Ontario in Canada?
Yeah,
it's a legitimate question.
Yeah, I really do think that it is, and this then sort of brings up that point of what do we really mean by right to exist when it comes to certain groups of people, and is the concept of people then still kind of tied to the existence of state? So I think in some ways what we're ultimately looking at could perhaps then be genetic population and creations of that genetic population. Like, does I suppose this is sort of then the civic nationalist versus the ethno-nationalist argument of, does a people exist as an idea? So, for example, if you had, like, the white British population, they upheld all of these values of, democracy, freedom of speech, da-da-da-da-da, but if in 100 years there were no white people left in that land for whatever reason, and it was all, like, brown Middle Easterners, but they still upheld the same values, would that still be the same people? Or would it not be the same people?
I don't think they would. I mean, I know I'm going to come off as, Mr. Racist here, and everyone knows I'm not alt-right, but I'd like to bring up a book written in the 80s, I think 1982, by Richard Dawkins called The Extended Phenotype. And in this book, Richard Dawkins, presumably everybody knows him, really famous biologist, and, talked about God a bit recently. Okay. Mostly well known for The Selfish Gene, and for this is his second most popular or famous book. Right? And he proposes the idea that a phenotype is not limited just to the pure biology of things. So whether that's tissue growth or eye color or whatever, but he argues that it should be extended to all the effects that a gene may have on its environment. And he talks about beavers, if I recall. It's been a while, but we could use the concept of beyond beavers, that inasmuch as we human beings are products of evolution too, and inasmuch as his theory of the extended phenotype is correct, we would have to assume that cultures themselves are part of the extended phenotype, and thus particular to genetic populations as manifestations of their phenotype, their biological phenotype. And so there's a cultural phenotype here as well, because a beaver's dam has a certain structure to it, but it's an extension of the beaver's phenotype. You see what I'm getting at? So I would argue,
it's sort of the genetic expression upon the environment.
Yes, and so you could argue, and I think there's good evidence for this, that across the world we see different cultural development. So, for example, why are East Asians on average more collectivist than European populations? Well, I did a video on this a while back. There does seem to be a greater prevalence in East Asian populations of social sensitivity alleles, which may be related to things like collectivism and social cohesion. It's just an idea. But we see advanced civilizations there, just like we've seen in Europe, but they tend to be more collectivist. They have different philosophies and outlooks. And you could argue that is part of the extended phenotype in East Asian civilizations, things like Confucianism or even Taoism, different perspectives on the world. And the systems you get there, they just look different because they're part of the extended phenotype, whereas In the West, you see different things. I mean, I've asked myself for a long time why you see particular institutional developments in Anglo-Saxon culture. You know, the idea of freedom and classical liberalism. These seem to me to be, at least in origin, fairly distinct English ideals that you don't actually see on the continent. So even there, you could argue there are differences in the extended phenotype, in as much as that's accurate. But I'm arguing, if you want to buy into the extended phenotype for beavers and birds and all kinds of non-human animals, you're going to have to buy into that for humans too. Otherwise, you're left in this morass of, yeah, it's all culture, and but it's all haphazard, and there's no explanation for the origin of culture. I call this there's that argument in Latin, Deus ex nihilo, God from nothing, cultura ex nihilo, culture from nothing. If we accept the extended phenotype, then we actually have an explanation for why cultures emerge, even if we don't have all the details.
Yeah, I mean, I'd sort of more on that side myself as well, because it's always seemed to me, even if you just took things like differences in IQ between populations, it shouldn't really be a surprise that that with a higher average seems to advance more than those populations with lower IQs. So it seems to me like, yeah, there must be some sort of genetic influence on culture in some capacity. So in that case, what we'd then be talking about in Right to Exist must then necessarily include not only the concept of a culture, but then also necessarily the concept of some sort of genetic population or some sort of gene expression or gene expression frequency.
Yeah. I would say the key is gene expression frequency. I don't think, 100%. I don't think any country needs to be 100% anything. And I don't know what the exact percent is, but there seems to be, if you look at the history of the 20th century, particularly in Great Britain, that when a population of immigrants, non-natives, exceeds some percent, and a lot of people say it's somewhere between 5 and 10, I reckon it's thereabouts too. On a sociological level, we just know that pressures tend to disappear for that population to conform to the overarching culture, the majority culture, and basically to assimilate, in as much as they can assimilate at all. And this is the basic explanation for why you get sort of Little Pakistan in some parts of Great Britain, where they have their own everything. Some people don't speak English. We've talked about this before.
Yeah, I live in one of those areas.
There you go. And where
yes,
even medical professionals can't intervene in people's consanguineous unions, where they say, well, maybe it's not the best idea to procreate with your first cousin because, it's God's fault or Satan or whatever it might be. It's Allah's will. And increasingly, I just see evidence, and I'm saying this actually from a neutral position, whatever people might believe, my position, that I don't think you can have a certain culture without the people, the genetic, effectively without the genome. You can't have a phenotype of a culture without the genetic phenotype and ultimately the genetics that produce those things, in as much as they're the majority. So, as you pointed out, if you had a bunch of Middle Easterners, UK becomes 90% Middle Eastern or Pakistani. I don't, even if they, well, I don't. That's the whole point. I don't think they would strive for the same institutions, or even maintain.
Cause it does seem like there is just something inherently different about it, and I that would, I suppose, then make sense. What with the concept of gene expression frequency in certain areas. So yeah, so we are now necessarily in a situation that Right to Exist must not only support the existence of ideas, but also something about the gene expression frequency within that population. So that's just sort of quite an interesting way to look at it, and there seems to be a fair amount of evidence that actually does support that then. There was something I was going to talk about. What was it? Oh yeah, it was about like the critical mass of different genetic populations entering certain areas, and we know that as outside genetic populations move into certain areas, basically long and short of loads of research which has been done on this is that as homogeny or as genetic population homogeny decreases, things like distrust increases, crime increases, basically all the negative sorts of things increase. And I think in some ways this harkens back, I think it was you and Coltane actually who had a discussion about this, the concept of a difference between an IQ state versus an ethno-state versus which one would then succeed more.
Well, I mean, and this is the thing, we can't really run this experiment because when we're talking about, say, Pakistani people or people from the Middle East, we're really talking about people who broadly fit into the mean across the board, and that includes IQ. So you're not, if you want to create an IQ state and get the very best of the best, the cream of the crop from all these populations, it would have to be very selective. There would be testing. I am curious to see which would do better in the long run, because so far we've never done that. We've only really had sort of, we could argue, sort of pseudo-ethno-states or de facto ethno-states. But I'm not entirely convinced. That's why I run the experiment. But I do lean towards the idea that an IQ state in the long run would be more successful. But that's almost impossible to stage. And the types of people, your friendly Pakistani neighbors, for example, I doubt they're the type of people who would be, and some fitted into that IQ state as good citizens, because most people cluster around the mean. And I think we do need to talk about that and the reality of that. It's one thing, so for example, it'd be one thing to have limited immigration, the maintenance of some kind of ethno-state, state based primarily on genetic population or the specifics of genetic population, and then as an immigration policy, you have limited immigration, and in as much as people do not correspond to that ethnicity, they need to, have at least an IQ of 130. Now, people I know in the alt-right would jump up and then talk about regression to the mean. The way they use it tends to be almost borderline non-scientific, because the way they talk about regression to the mean, they talk about it like, well, evolution wouldn't even work because, every time there'd be some mutation that added a positive benefit, everything would just regress back to the mean. But still, I think that would be a decent idea, but that would not include just sort of acceptance of anyone, and the idea that anyone can blend into. And even to be fair, I've talked a lot to Australians. Even when you get a relatively high IQ population like the Han Chinese that have been basically taking over Australia, they still change things. They still change the fabric of the society. So yes, and they tend to be on average, 5 points higher in the IQ scale than white Europeans. But the way they interact with each other, the way they interact with the world, it's different. So even there, possibly you might want to make an argument that possibly it wouldn't work. I don't know, but in any event, we know, because we can observe, that the importation of people of relatively low IQ, or relative to the population that they're immigrating to, who come from different cultures and different genetic stock, doesn't seem to work. It creates division, and in as much as it does work, I've observed this in the United States, they tend to be, like I said, high IQ people. So, Silicon Valley, people of different ethnicities, all really bright. But for the average person, the laborer stuck in some part of London, who's sort of the last white guy in the street, it tends not to work out too well, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the Chinese in Australia and how they're changing things, even though they are then higher. So that actually then somewhat seems to suggest that the phenotypic expression on the environment seems to come through then, possibly regardless of some sort of IQ, which would then might suggest that if you were to set up some sort of IQ state, you did go down the more civic nationalist route, but said like, hey, we only want really, really smart people, we want the best, the cream of the crop from everywhere in the world, that you'd still then either end up changing the culture there, or you'd end up having lots of people and still having a lot of discord within it.
Possibly, because there seems to be, this is not definitive, but there does seem to be, outside of basically Northern Europe, a greater tendency towards collectivism. And you have to wonder why all these European countries themselves, or nations or tribes over time, why the sort of modern democratic ideal, or at least the classical liberal ideal, seems so particular to the Anglo, the eternal Anglo, and to a lesser extent in Scandinavia. There have been some arguments made by people. There's a guy, Kevin MacDonald, he's much loathed because he's, for various reasons, mostly because he's obsessed with Jews, for better or worse. But he makes the argument that people in Northern Europe in particular had to develop much more individualist societies because of the environment, and societies of greater egalitarianism and what have you. Whereas other places of the world, cultures tend to be much more collectivist. And he might be right. In fact, quite possibly he's right. Because, once again, we do not see this manifestation of classical liberalism any other place in the world. Even civilizations at their height, China, for example, you didn't see that. Of course, you didn't really see that in classical antiquity either in Europe, but then again, different Europeans, but different genetic population. So I think it's a reasonably open-ended question, but it's one you do have to consider, that it might not be possible if Australia became entirely non-white Anglo, that the foundations of the country and its structures would change completely. And the same could theoretically be said of the United Kingdom. Actually, a good example, I think, of a kind of unintentional experiment that's been going on for the better part of 50 years is the United States, where the majority of people had been sort of Northern European origin. There used to be legislation that was done away with in 1965 to change that, and you can see the fabric of society has changed greatly. There's a rough correlation, I'd argue, between that change in policy and the growth of the welfare state to the point where it is now, at least. Is there a relationship there? I think it's probable, although it might be indeterminable ultimately. Anyway, I'm done talking.
Well, it does kind of make sense when you view it in that capacity, that because we've not really had welfare states or anything like that, especially in the UK, up until kind of like the last century, really. But then there's also been a lot of environmental change in that last century, what with the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
So I would that then necessarily, I suppose that then would just be another phenotypical response to an environmental change, allowing another behavior to be made more manifest.
It worked pretty well. I mean, when Scandinavian countries shifted over to the current welfare model, it worked pretty well, as long as the population stayed primarily Scandinavian and small, in addition to that. When the numbers were exceeded, and I mean, you see this in continental Europe, the welfare isn't working out too well, there's just too many people. Its original purpose is being abused too. There are all kinds of problems beyond some of the things we're talking about. But I think that the United States in particular has seen a huge shift towards, I guess, what you could almost call pocket collectivism. You see different small groups all clamoring for the goodies.
Which is the migrant groups, and well, it's the same thing that's happening in Europe somewhat. that a lot of migrant groups move in, and they almost invariably, if they're legally permitted to engage in the democratic process, they almost always then pull it towards that more collectivist, we want more stuff, more people to contribute.
Well, look at Khan in London. I mean, do you think a majority English population would have voted for him to be mayor?
No, I really don't.
No. So it's clear. I mean, and look, we can have a discussion about all these things after we ascertain the truth, but it just seems that in the mainstream, forget about it. But even in the skeptic community, there's no discussion about this. And I rebuke the claim that merely talking about this and acknowledging the distinct possibility that some of these points are true automatically renders you alt-right or some sort of division of the SS brigade, you know?
Well, I just hate that attitude in general, because it's the same thing. It's the same attitude that we've seen feminists and social justice. It's basically just shout some sort of label which is generally conceded to be negative, and that's where the argument ends. It's not even an argument, it's name-calling.
Yeah, people are very, very sensitive about these things. Not so understandably to me, but I understand why they're so sensitive. But we need to talk about we need to develop a theory of culture, a true theory of culture. And any theory of culture will have to include Dawkins' own idea of an extended phenotype, a phenotype that goes beyond the mere biological faculties as an extension of the genome, and so I don't know how else you can talk about it. Otherwise, you're just talking about, like I said, this cultura ex nihilo, where it just comes out of nowhere for whatever reason. It's there.
Yeah, so it just is. It's
right.
I don't buy that explanation at all. It's stuff just doesn't come out of nowhere. There is always some trigger for it.
But that's what kind of what Sargon argues. He'll just say it's just culture. I've gotten discussions in lives. He just sort of dismisses the idea. Well, he'll say it's just yes, but cultures are a product of people. So
But then why do different people manifest this in different ways? Well, we know environment will be a part of it, but why is it then still, when people share an environment, does it still seem to be different? It's like one of the things when it comes to, say, migrant populations to Western countries. We know that the environment does change certain faculties of their behavior, because if you look at like a lot of Middle Eastern migrants, when the first generations who come in tend to have lots of children, 5, 6, 7, because that's how things are done in their country, and they'll normally have a lot of those children when they're in that country. But then their children, the birth rate a lot of the time goes down to the same baseline as the local populace. So we know that, say, there is that environmental pressure which will change that. But if, say, you were to take that example of the East Asians having certain alleles which are associated with perhaps a more sensitive, what was the word you used?
Social sensitivity alleles.
So, a more social sensitive way of doing things, that would then still carry over, or could then still carry over into that. So while they may adapt certain facets of their behavior, other facets might be perhaps less influenced,
it's a really
or not at all.
Question. And I'll tell you why. Because I had a Korean ex who would be a kind of a perfect guinea pig, because she left for the States when she was 15 or was 16, and so had developed quite a bit of her personality as a sort of ascending towards adulthood in the United States, but obviously had retained a lot of the sort of Koreanness, if you will, and I leave this for the audience to decipher, but because I still can't, I don't really have a really good hypothesis here or explanation. And then when she was in Western situation, Europe or the United States, she would act more or less like a Western person would. And then when there was a Korean around, or she was back home, other things, she would start basically acting, so the Korean collectivists would take on that role. Almost like a chameleon. But I know for a fact that she was very cognizant of the differences. and we sometimes had talked about this, but this ability to almost instinctually shift versus reports I hear about Korean Americans who spend all their lives in the United States, but then spend some stint in South Korea, really struggle, and as a rule don't necessarily enjoy it very much. So that's kind of an open-ended question where the cutoff date is. That maybe there's a kind of, so for example, in language there's something called the critical period, the point up until which a child can acquire a language with nigh perfect fluency, grammatically, in terms of the sounds, phonology, etc. My ex was, interestingly enough, a little bit past the critical period, so her English was really, really good, but she made some mistakes, and it almost seems to coincide with her chameleon-like nature of sort of shrugging off one cultural meme, as it were, and when moving into the other and then back and forth. Whereas I've never observed that, for example, Koreans who spent their entire lives in Korea, move to a Western environment, Anglo environment, they always retain their sort of Korean nature, whereas Korean Americans seem to struggle with that. And so I don't have the answers here, but there's something going on here that might be related to degree of exposure and even neurological development, because it's certainly language acquisition is related to neurological development. And at some point in time, there are limitations imposed, hard limits, whether it applies to acquiring the grammar or the system of sounds. There might be a relationship there. I don't know. I've thought about it quite a bit, but I've not come to any firm conclusion on this. It also might be, as final point, and then I'll let you speak gobs and gaggles, that South Korean population has an average IQ of about 106. It might be that higher IQ allows for greater, in theory at least, greater cultural flexibility in terms of assimilation, and I'll leave it at that.
Now that is an interesting one, because what that might then imply is that if you wanted to then consider the concept of a more civic nationalist compared to an ethno-nationalist approach, that then could work. Because if people then had that exposure within that critical time, that it could then make the transition basically complete.
Yeah. So, for example, getting back to the Chinese thing, I don't think there are good studies on this. My impression of the quote-unquote Chinese takeover of Australia is that these people are arriving in their early 20s, mid-20s, or students, which would be way past, say, the equivalent critical period for acquiring language. And then you could argue, in theory, way past based on these suppositions, the critical period to acquire the culture, as it were. Maybe. I don't know. Just throwing these ideas out here. We're kind of cooking up ideas.
Well, yeah, that's the entire point of this, because it's right to exist, and then how do you define, people as a thing? Like, can you define state by people, or can you define state by idea? And then how would one go about preserving that? So we've sort of got some data points which seem to suggest that there is some sort of inherent something maybe that predisposes people towards perhaps certain ways of organizing themselves, but as with so many things, it's an environmental feedback loop with the genes.
Yes.
So that if they're in the correct environment, it'll be reinforced and it'll express itself completely. Whereas if you take them to somewhere else during that critical development period, it can maybe sort of be overwritten, but perhaps only to a certain degree, which then sort of implies if you've got non-assimilating populations, then what they're basically doing is activating the original genes, which are then at odds to, say, an environment like Europe when it comes to the Middle Eastern people.
Yeah.
So it's really like there's kind of data points for both sides here that potentially you could make a more civic nationalist approach work, or other ones
should be added here as well, that when people bring up the second and third generation, who often grow up in these kind of ethnic ghettos, are not getting the authentic, real culture. You know, if you grow up in a Pakistani ghetto in some urban center in London, in the UK, that's hardly, you know, assimilated to the greater culture.
Yeah, it really isn't. It's those areas, they're nothing like the rest of the country. It really is like going into a third world country when you go into those areas. Just everything is different. Just not only in how it's really hard to describe unless you've gone sort of from one to the other, but everything just feels different. Like just how people interact, how people carry themselves, just little things about how people behave, even just things like how people drive, how people walk down the street. Just everything is just, it's not quite the same. There's something different about it, just a fundamental feeling. Like it's really hard to sort of objectively quantify, but it is just very different in some ways.
That would be an argument for this idea that there's a critical mass. I think that's actually indisputable. It's just we don't know exactly what that number might be. If we knew what the critical mass number were, then we could, you know, design a policy that would allow for immigration of, you know, maybe imposing IQ limits or whatever, but would not, an immigration policy that would not exceed that critical mass. But alas, we don't. There's
I'd
no
still question if over time, like you only allow these small trickles of people in. Let's say for the sake of the thought experiment, because that's what so much of this is, just entertaining an idea for the sake of entertaining it.
Yes.
I do want to make that very clear to people here. This is largely just spitballing because it's an interesting thing to think about. That if there are genetic underpinnings to certain behaviors, well, we know that there are when it comes to people, and if there are certain ones which then apply to larger social behaviors, which again we've got pretty good evidence to suggest that might be the case. Even if people came in, assimilated perfectly, if you could still obtain a critical mass after that point. So if you, say, just let loads of like Middle Eastern people in really, really slowly, like you just trickled them into, say, somewhere like the UK over time, if whether the critical mass point might increase or something, but still be there. So whether it might end up with sort of a 50% population, and then it's kind of like you still get a subtle, tiny shift as a result of, say, single alleles or something like that then results in a shift still happening.
It's possible. I think it's possible you can't entirely exclude. I mean, so for example, there's still in the United States, it's so mixed up. There are, I know, Korean communities within the United States that are pretty collectivist and pretty don't really mix. And
did they start really, really small though, and actually integrate from the offset though?
Yeah, that's the question. Well, that's the thing. They started off small. They probably try to integrate, but for example, in New York City, Queens, huge Korean population, Korean American population, and it's not really a ghetto because Koreans don't really create ghettos, but it's definitely a kind of ethno community or ethno neighborhood that's distinguishable from others. The other thing I've noticed, and this is, we're spitballing here. I've noticed that Asian American content producers on YouTube. So there's a guy named David So. He's a comedian, Korean American comedian, who, you know, the people he associates with, on average, they're not always Korean, but they tend to be Asian too. Whether, you know, he doesn't seem to have a lot of affiliations with white people, as an example. I'm not saying that, and I've seen this with other Asian, not just Asian American, sort of Anglo-Asian content producers, that a lot of their interaction is with other people. Oh, another great example, growing up. when I attended university as an undergraduate, there were many different groups, but interestingly, there were 4 very distinct groups. You had Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, who would not interact with people outside of their own, you could say, ethnicity, but they would speak English to each other. And we had the FOBs, the fresh off the boats, Koreans who came much, much later, and Chinese who also had their own groups, but in turn would not integrate with the Korean Americans or Chinese Americans respectively. So, you know, maybe. I mean, I remember I was much younger, me being the hyper individualist that I was, and I'd kind of interact. I said, why don't you ever hang out with other people? And they didn't really have a good explanation. Sort of shrugged their shoulders. It wasn't a hostility. It's just there was no real point in talking to, say, white people or black people or whatever, Hispanic people, beyond the necessities of course or whatever. But still, yeah. Anyway, some ideas thrown out there.
Well, I think also, and I suppose this is a point which lends more weight to the idea of genetic populations and their self-segregation, is that things like, I've actually got a really big study which I'm still sort of reading my way through, which was looking at Big Five personality traits by country. We know that Big Five personality traits, they're basically 50-50 heritability to environmental expression, so it's kind of a half-half thing. And there are, or do at least appear to be, some quite different personality profiles from country to country as averages as well. So that might also be something that then influences people's, I don't want to say like ability to integrate or willingness. It just seems to be something that happens. Like there's no, it's almost something like that. It's like there's no maliciousness on their part to sort of not integrate. It's just that,
well, it's, as I said,
it's just harder or something.
When I asked the Korean Americans why they didn't talk to people who weren't Korean American, they couldn't offer an explanation. They just kind of shrugged their shoulders, and that was it. Yeah,
it really does seem like people want to segregate themselves based on something. I suppose that ties nicely into social identity theory, that people always have many different identities by which they see themselves, and I suppose race being sometimes used as a proxy for things like that in social sciences, it can just be that it's an unavoidable facet of humanity that people will notice it and will, even without malice, just kind of end up in patterns like that.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean,
which then I suppose highlights kind of the idea that when we talk about right to exist for states and people, we must necessarily then be talking about people and some sort of gene expression frequency. I suppose that then just kind of really pushes that.
That's where the bits of evidence we do have, that's the direction it points to. Yeah, I'd say.
Okay, so I know we've taken quite a while to sort of get round to this, but there's just a lot of things to consider in this. So if that's the case, then I suppose I will bring up the other thing here about just general conservation and the ideas around that. It's much easier when we talk about it, say, in the framing of animals as opposed to people, because people don't get as triggered when you talk about animals.
Save the newt. Newt.
Yeah, all of this sort of stuff. Save the newts, save the pandas, save the whales, all of this sort of stuff. We know that when a population of animals in a certain area shrinks to a certain size, we know that when that's a problem or when it's not. We know when animals are abundant or when they're not. And when they shrink to a certain population in a certain area, it's, we must do something. We must protect those animals. We must protect their habitats, their food supplies. We must stop logging or littering or whatever's going on in that area, and perhaps establish some sort of captive breeding program and things like that. And all of that is based on how many there are in that certain area. But when it comes to dealing with humans, we don't just deal with that, because if you, and this is then I suppose going back to the ever increasing presence of arguments for ethno-states and things like that, if you were to go just by, say, the white population of like the UK, it's like, well, it's going up. It's just continuously still going up. But as a proportion of the whole, it's coming down. So you can't just go on, well, what's the total number? Because it seems to then just be the total where they are as a percentage of the sum. That sort of then seems to be the trigger point. And so I think, does that then mean, and this is where it comes to right to exist, does that mean that when a certain genetic population reaches a certain point, do we then have to start actually saying, if we want to preserve that particular culture or that particular way of life, that particular way of thinking, must we then necessarily consider the idea of actually helping a certain genetic pool to continue to exist? And we already do this. I mean, you've mentioned Aboriginals in Canada, Australia, things like that. We do this already, but for some reason we don't do it for other populations. And that's sort of the point of, well, why not? It's like, if we recognize that those smaller populations...
Because those populations are minorities and the others are, at the very least, not viewed as minorities. Or they don't have power. I mean, for example, pardon me, if you wipe out or render very endangered a certain animal population, everyone acknowledges that animal population... I'll give you an example. The pangolin. Do you know what the pangolin is?
I do. They are one of my favorite animals.
Oh, there you go. But then you would also know that they're the most exploited animal on the planet for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
They're found throughout Africa and Asia. I think there are 5 subspecies. Anyway, the point is that we know that the pangolin is, a minority that doesn't have power, as it were. So we want, ideally, to extend our protection to the pangolin. When you talk about whitey, as it were, whitey, there's a completely different view. Whereas someone from the Cherokee Nation who suffered, for centuries under the quote-unquote oppressive white man, and there's just a different level of perception that cannot be extended, it seems, by people to majority populations, majority European populations, and what have you. And yeah, I think that's the main issue at the end of the day. I mean, there's a kind of pangolin analogy in that people who are perceived as having power are not granted that status as potentially being endangered or at risk of extinction. But I think you brought up a really good point too, in that it's also a matter of the ratio of the population to the other population there. So, 50, 60 years ago, there wasn't a massive Caribbean or Middle Eastern or Pakistani population in Great Britain. And so, effectively, we're talking about apples and oranges.
Yeah, so this is why I sort of find this really interesting, and why I want to just sort of try and figure some stuff out about it. Like, if we're talking about that, and you still have a majority population, but if you then have other populations coming in and displacing that population, that larger population shrinks as a percentage of the whole. Would there be any value in the protection of that still majority there? Or does it expressly have to sort of become a point where they are a minority? But the problem is, if you were to do that in, say, Europe and things like that, you might end up in a situation where the entire governmental way of doing things is completely destroyed. Like, yeah. I mean, I find it very hard to believe personally that if you had a majority Muslim population in anywhere in the UK, that it would remain a democracy for very long. I can't help but think that it would end up theocratic, or at least as a theocratic democracy somehow.
I actually could say quite a bit about this, I think. Well, let's talk about modern conservatism, or conservationism, rather. I don't think this is, I mean, some people argue this is an inherent trait to European. I don't think so, because European people have abused the environment and run many species into extinction, but with the onset of modernity, it really only seems to be people of European descent who really are concerned with these issues of environment, and even minority populations. So, for example, the way the Japanese have dealt with the Ainu population, which is a indigenous population native to the island of Hokkaido, has been, well, they don't really care. I mean, yeah, there's some effort, but they don't really care in the same way that some Americans might care about some, the Cherokee population or the Navajo population, or Australians might care about Aborigines. The way the Chinese have dealt with pollution, right? There used to be, I believe it's the Yangtze River dolphin. I think it's extinct. Can guess why it's extinct. There are a bunch of reasons, but pollution's one of them. Which was fresh water dolphin, by the way. There seems to be, I don't know if minority population is enough status. I do think, I agree with you, I don't think if Europeans actually became a minority, anyone would care. There might be some lone wolves and think, well, we need to do something. But I don't think this seems to be a kind of, this is something that some people talk about, the concept of universal morality as opposed to tribal morality. That is, codes of conduct that constrain you universally, broadly, regarding everybody, or only those people you're related to, or kin, or your tribe. Those who possess, the same, generally speaking, similar alleles or similar DNA. And I think that is also a bit of a Northern European concept. It seems to be. Once again, we have to look at these ideas. Universal morality, or at the very least, it's a European thing, more European thing than anything else, because part of the consequences of a universal morality would be to be concerned about everybody. If you have a collectivist morality, as is manifested in Middle Eastern populations, well, you don't really see a concern for everybody else. You see a concern for the tribe. And same with China. I mean, so
it's interesting that comes up both in China and the Middle East, because obviously in the Middle East, especially, you've got Islam, and Islam is a very big social factor, although I'd say it's, as with a lot of things, it's social as has sprung from biology, but the idea that everything basically must be cleansed and purged in the name of Islam, and everyone must become Islamic by necessity. But it's interesting that the same pattern of behavior, the general, well, we only really care about the in-group, out-groups, meh, whatever, if you survive, you survive, you don't, also extends to populations outside of that area. Even if it's, again, in a non-malicious way, it's just simply a cold indifference, if nothing else.
Yeah.
And it is interesting that, I suppose this is the thing that people have referred to as the pathological altruism of white people, where they can give so much of a shit about groups which aren't themselves that it can then work to their own detriment.
Yeah, and then there's the, magic dirt theory.
I have never even heard of that.
That's not a real theory, it's kind of an internet meme, but magic dirt theory is basically, you take Mustafa from wherever, or some Somali guy, and you plant him in Glasgow, and he becomes a Scotsman, or Stockholm, and he becomes a Swede, and basically that.
Those
magic dirt theory.
Those people, yeah,
that's magic dirt theory.
Okay, that's the one. I've heard quite a lot of that. Then it's the Abdul Muhammad possessed a German passport, so clearly he wasn't from another country. Okay, then.
Yeah, and I think,
if you say so.
Yeah, and there's that does seem to be the case. There are definitely. I think this is a sort of later development. I mean, you have to be really nuanced about this because Europeans, managed to virtually deforest, for example, Iceland and wipe out the native wolf population of both Ireland and Great Britain. And there are lots of arguments you can make historically that they didn't give a shit about conservation. But as civilization developed, that idea of universal morality and as applies to the world at large and the environment seemed to spring forth from that. So most conservationism, not all of it, is kind of a European thing, or people, or at least descended European. The Japanese, if there were, there are some Japanese activists, but if there weren't Western protestations against, whaling or dolphin safe tuna, let's be honest. You really think the Japanese would be?
Well, yeah, they're still engaging in it.
Yeah, they don't care.
But then again, so is Norway.
Yeah, that's true.
Although I suppose they're more of the northern European, they're a bit more separate.
Well, I guess, but even in that case, and there, to be fair, I should to add, sort of counter the Faroese, who insist on these pilot whale harvests, which people they hate, but they say it's tradition. Actually, the Faroese are kind of moving away from that, but that's only because the pilot whale meat has so much mercury in it, so it's not even really edible anymore. In fact, pregnant women are advised, as far as I remember, pregnant Faroese women not to consume it at all, and other people in very limited quantities. So there's that sort of thrust of tradition, but I think once you have that kind of liberal, and I don't mean sort of left liberal, but sort of classical liberal demeanor, you can easily develop a philosophy of conservationism that you don't find in other parts of the world, even very well developed ones, such as Japan and Korea, and certainly not China.
I question whether or not the classical liberalism point is even necessary there, because we've seen nationalist organizations who are very big into that, although that's probably just more because they tend to be conservative. But if you look at like natural conservation things like woodland conservation and animal conservation, National Socialist Germany was one of the first countries in Europe to really do that on a very big scale, and they definitely weren't of the classical liberal mindset.
Yeah. I think there's actually a guy called Mark Collett. He's used to be involved with the BNP. He's very involved in white national or British nationalism, and I think he's from what I understand, a pretty big conservationist. So there's some relationship there as well, that the people are of the land, and so are the flora and fauna, and so you need to preserve that. But that's not. I think that's less a kind of that's sort of more, I guess, a perception of an extension of the people. So if the people are of the land, and the land itself is of the land, and so the flora and fauna are part of the land, rather than a kind of, oh wow, the Japanese are harvesting minke whales across the globe, we need to do something about that. Greenpeace rides in on their motor raft boats, and it's a bit different, I think, in terms of the angle, if you understand what I'm getting at.
Yeah, it might just be sort of a difference of thing. It's more just a convergence of evolution, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's another interesting one there. And then I suppose bring it all the way back around. Do then the people have a right to exist in this thing? So if we wanted to go down this route, which there is a good degree of evidence pointing towards, but some against, we've mentioned both, very important, that if then you wanted to say that people, state as in area of land and people, these are in some way an inseparable thing, not totally inseparable, but that there is something tied to certain genetic population or gene expression frequency or something like that to X way of life, does that then mean that that thing has a right to exist, which I think inherently we would say probably not, because, well, historically no one has ever said, no, well, we can't do away with them because reasons. But then how would one go about preserving something like that? I mean, obviously we've got the problem in Europe at the moment where we're going to get all of the comments about how incredibly alt-right we are for all of this, but like I said, it's just an interesting thing to consider. But we've got to the white populations being displaced from certain areas, and it is leading to objective cultural changes. I mean, we've got certain areas in big cities in the UK now where they're basically no-go areas for non-Islamic people.
Well, Teal, there's actually another, I wanted to mention this, sorry for interrupting, but
okay, please
something
do.
else, that pretty glaring thing that has nothing to do with this. I mean, even if you were to say it's all, culture, and, culture just kind of springs forth from the great nothingness, whatever, you still need to get, pardon me, a bit under the weather, you still need to gather the balls to say, you need to assimilate, and your culture is inferior to mine. Who in the mainstream is willing to do that, by the way?
Oh, I don't know of anyone really.
Exactly. So that, even if you were to say culture has nothing to do with genes, you still need to have the gumption to say, well, we'll accept you, Muhammad and Mustafa and Ling, but you got to come here and you got to do exactly as we do, and your culture, it kind of sucks compared to ours, and yeah, that's how it is. Who's willing to do that in the mainstream? Maybe Sargon would be willing to say that. I don't think anyone in the mainstream...
Well, he has openly said that he is a cultural chauvinist and does actually genuinely believe that the Western culture is superior.
There you go.
So I suppose that's probably about as mainstream as it's going to get, although I've read on several reputable news sources that apparently he's an alt-right neo-Nazi sympathizer or something, so...
Yeah, well...
that went a long way, didn't it?
Yeah.
You talked to this guy called Millennial Woes. Clearly this means you are a hireling, jackbooted thug who just wants to gas people. All right?
Yeah. Gas the Canucks race war now. That's a joke, by the way. Joke. Anyway. But yeah,
welcome to the world where we have to explain jokes and say, this is a... don't just...
Right. But even that, I mean, that's a huge issue. Even if magic dirt theory were true, you would still have to say that, the dirt whence you came is not as good as our dirt,
Yeah, I suppose that then kind of renders the necessity of protecting genetic populations, I suppose, somewhat moot, because it's still like, if that cultural thing was, as you said, from nothing, then you still have to be willing to say, defend our culture because reasons.
Yeah.
And no one's going to do that. There's no way in hell you're going to get enough people saying, well, you need to defend the gene expression frequency, which allows that phenomenon to then manifest. I suppose it's, you have to get people to accept the observable phenomenon first, and then actually get them to protect the other part which causes it later, assuming they were even willing to accept that, which I think most people aren't.
Here's the other thing that's very important, I think, to mention, is that different... if people are different, and it's hard to dispute that they are, then different populations will look at other populations as, if not antagonists, at the very least rivals for acquiring resources and attempting to shape policy. So you could look in an evolutionary sense. You could look at the election of Khan in London as a kind of an evolutionary success. Somebody who's going to represent the extended phenotypic interests of the Pakistani population in some sense. And you see this throughout the United States with Hispanics voting for Hispanics, blacks voting for blacks. It's a big thing with Jews. So, yeah, when you have lots of different populations under the umbrella of a country, you seem to have lots of divergent interests. I mean, they all have, in some sense, similar interests. Everyone who wants, wealth and access to resources, but they're all competing for those resources. So.
Yeah, and it always seems to be within that same group. That seems to be the overriding social identity for a lot of groups, except for white European populations. They seem to have that a lot less.
Yeah, they do. I mean, you still get that de facto in the Midwest and some of the more rural areas of the United States. But in urban areas, it's bizarre. You kind of get gentrification, but you also get a lot of collectivist mindset. Certainly in New York City, that's really big. People call it a melting pot, which I should add. The melting pot isn't an actual term. It was created from New York. It was actually a Russian Jew living in London who created that term, but neither here nor there.
Oy vey.
Oy vey. But it's this kind of this place that is a bit more of a tossed salad of lots of different people not really interacting with each other, but they have different origins and different cultures and what have you. It's that's the tossed salad, and I think as a rule, white people don't really go down that route as much, at least. Although I should argue that one thing social justice has done, in my view at least, has created a kind of proxy for kind of kin group, in the sense that you get people from all kinds of races joined together in the social justice parade, united under the banner of cultural social justicism, or what have you. And that's kind of interesting. Because you do see all kinds of people engaging in social justice.
That is true. I suppose that's then maybe social justice is the thing that is strong enough to override ethnicity as a social identity, perhaps.
Yeah.
Because it's still something that then works to their own benefit.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. So if you have a bunch of groups who are looking to siphon off resources from a majority population, then they'll work together. So, for example, this happened in the 60s during the civil rights movement between Jews and Black Americans, Jewish American and Black. They worked reasonably well together. There's a lot more hostility these days between those groups, I think, for pretty obvious reasons. But at the time, it was beneficial to those groups to work together to effectively engage in kind of a resource acquisition, if you will. So it's a conflict of interest, and they happen to have those common interests at the time. And they were basically fighting against you could say, Northwestern European majority in that sense. And now you have, with the Hispanic population, a lot of Black Americans hostile towards the Hispanic population because another group to compete with for resources. And so.
It really does seem like some sort of racial strife is an inevitability for humans. The more and more you look at it.
I think so. I mean, obviously, it goes without saying, there are always exceptions, but most people conform to whatever stereotype they might precede them, and there does seem to be ethnic, racial conflict between people who view themselves as distinct, as having distinct interests, or in-group interests versus out-group interests. And it does appear to be the case that unique among the populations of the world, the European population, the white European population, has this tendency to apply universal morals and values to other people, whereas other people, To be fair, I mean, I'm not the first person who said this. And like I said, anyone who's interested, whatever your particular slant might be. Kevin MacDonald has done quite a bit of this. I think it's in a book called The Tribe That Shall Dwell Alone. I mean, whether you justified or not, he's obsessed with Jews, and so he's done a lot of research on it. And he argues, for example, that the Middle Eastern origins of Jewish identity are collectivists and have a kind of in-group morality, versus the origins of their host countries that are more universalist in their approach. But there's probably some truth to that. And the question really is, how do we get to a stage where we can get this into the public discourse? Because we can't we can theorize on solutions. But then we're just in the realm of theory, because we already know what the solutions are. Then if these things are true, then you want a limited external flow. You could even say gene flow of some sense, in some sense, or cultural flow, however you want to term it. But we're not in power. This isn't real. So how do you get this stuff into the public forums for discussion without it being dismissed outright? Because even on the internet, even on YouTube, the skeptic community refuses to acknowledge that some of this might be true.
Well, many of them I've just found are intellectual cowards, frankly. They don't even want to entertain the possibility of some ideas because, I think it's because a lot of them are fundamentally left-leaning, so I think a degree of social constructionist mindset for them is a necessity. Frankly.
But I think it's also just sort of the clique needing to hold together.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. There is a lot of that, but that could be an entire thing in and of itself. Pulling us back onto the topic, right. Then, just for funsies, because this was one of the things which sort of prompted this, and this was I've watched a few of the videos, like from Sargon and McCard talking to Millennial Woes here, and obviously Woes is of the position that a genetic group, in this instance white Europeans, should be preserved, and that there should be efforts made to preserve that, whether that means the reduction of immigration, socialized, what's the word I'm looking for? Like basically socialized encouraging of white people to breed with white people and to maintain that population and develop some sort of in-group preference or a stronger form of in-group preference, which necessitates some sort of collective interest or some sort of collective overview of the subject. Not a totally collectivist thing, because obviously you do allow for the fact that they are individual people and they will do individual things, but there should be some sort of shared goal almost between them. And Sargon was more of the viewpoint of, no, just individuals, you be the change that you want to be. But to my mind, the total individualist approach, this hyper-individualist idea of, well, just focus on individuals and everything will be fine, to me that seems like it's something that would simply lack the effectiveness of being able to actually maintain some sort of group manifestation. Because even if we did go down the culture from nothing, it's the good old magic dirt theory sort of thing, you'd still have to address it as some sort of group concern. Like, it wouldn't be good enough to just say, well, one person over there believes that, well, I guess that means everything's fine. You'd still need to work within a population. And if you went down the route of culture related to genetic expression, which I think there's more evidence to suggest that might be the case to a greater or lesser degree, then you're looking at genetic population preservation, which, if that's the case, you definitely can't take it from a total individual angle.
The problem,
you have to have something.
The problem here, and I agree with you, is that it's all well and good. I'm an individualist. I feel it in my bones. That's why I don't belong to any club, whether it be MGTOW or alt-right or whatever. But I don't think you can sort of scream into the wind and say, individualism, when manifestly, you have large groups of people who don't buy into it at all. I mean, if you want to go down with your ship, yeah, you can talk about individualism all day. But as far as policy is concerned, I mean, clearly not everyone values individualism as much as Sargon does. And so, you know, he just seems to be dogmatically sticking to this point for the sake of sticking to it, in my view.
Well, that is a possibility. I want to sort of try and avoid necessarily the dramas of the
No, I agree. I agree. I mean, you could just look at Sargon as a kind of symbol, or the epitome of the guy who says individualism above all. It doesn't matter if he's Sargon or not.
Yeah. I would agree with that, then.
He might feel in his bones, that person, but a lot of people won't, and don't. You know, you can't... you can't base policy off of individual traits, I don't think. You should probably...
Well, it's not practical.
Yeah,
we always end up on some sort of group thing. It's like, it's a bit of a tangent, but I was actually talking to someone months ago about things like age of consent, and they were talking about, oh, well, different people mature at different rates, so surely, you know, the idea of having one thing, you know, one age is just ridiculous. You know, you need to, you know, you should take it on an individual case-by-case basis. And my response was, okay, well, how are we going to do that? Are we going to have every single person, you know, from the age of like 10 years old, and even that's arbitrary, every month, 2 months, 6 months, every year, you know, interviewed by a psychiatrist, you know, specializing in sexual health or something, to then say, oh, well, you've answered this number of questions or assessed you based on this, you now get a certificate that says you can go and have sex. Is that really practical? Well, no. So we just have to kind of say, about there, and just kind of draw a line for everyone. So much as it might be the idealized way of saying, yes, we can do everything on an individual basis, simply for practicality purpose, it's an impossibility. Like, you have to address people as some sort of group.
Yeah.
And this is where I find, again, a lot of the more skeptical folks of the YouTubes, like, as soon as you try and do anything like that, say, like, well, you have to address this as a group issue because taking it down to an individual basis is just impractical. You could not do it. Not without an unreasonable expenditure of time, effort, or resources. So it's kind of idealized situation to result, and, well, we just have to pick the cheaper route, unfortunately, because we're not in a case of infinite time, infinite energy.
Precisely. I mean, that's the thing. In an ideal world of unlimited time and resources, you could do that, but... And I mean, even politicians, mainstream politicians, talk about voting demographics and you know, the Hispanic vote. If you look at the election, in the elections in the States for the president, they'll talk about the Hispanic vote, the black vote. They talk about groups. They don't say, you know, Juan Lopez in the Hispanic group who voted. They talk about the Hispanic vote, basically. So people do this in the mainstream, to a degree.
Yeah, well, because it's frankly a necessity, and when you're able to, you know, construct entire psychological profiles of people based off of small groups of people, and those models are then effective for larger populations, that kind of says everything you really need to know. For all the differences between people, they're not that different, and certain groups of people are not that different. You know, there's differences between some of those groups, but the variety within those groups is, you know, it's immaterial compared to the ones in between. So there's some interesting things to think about there. I'm just sort of reading through some of because I tried to do this as like a write-up for a video, and I was just like, I have no idea. I must discuss this idea further with other people, so this is why we're here. So from this point of view, it becomes necessary to, in some way, collectivize some group of people, either by culture or by genes or by by possibly both or something. You need to earmark in some way, some collection of something to say that, well, this is what we define as this particular cultural thing. And then you'd have to then say, okay, well, if this is the case, how are we then going to preserve it? A, does it have a right to exist, which I think we've defined inherently no, but do we want it to continue to exist? And in the instance of, say, Western population, I would say absolutely yes. By whatever metric you choose to measure the success of Western culture compared to other culture, I would say that Western culture will come out on top in pretty much every metric that you'd want. Rates of personal wealth for people, living standards, lifetime, how long people live, medical care, levels of education. It's unrivaled. Amount of free money for spending on luxuries. The West is just unrivaled when it comes to this. The only thing that we seem to outstrip other countries on is rates of mental health problems, which is a bit of an interesting one. But if, say, you wanted to take all of these things and say, okay, this is then worth protecting, you can't, to my mind, then take that on a purely individual basis, which then sort of begs the question, well, how do you go about creating some sort of strategy to preserve it? And is it just a case of perhaps then the uncomfortable idea that we must simply say, look, we can't treat all people the same and all people as equal and all people as this. We must necessarily take some step to promote, say, something about what people would call white culture, or some people would call white culture, if you just wanted to say that it's purely cultural, or from a genetic standpoint. Which again, yeah. I'm not sure how you'd go about doing that. Child limits on non-white people or something like that, or tax breaks for married white couples or something along those lines. I think but when you start going down this route, you're talking about genetic testing and genetic purity, which is just, again, it's effort to reward, and then is it worth it? And then that throws up a load of moral questions and quandaries in itself. And that's assuming you get that far before someone's shouted the word Nazi, eugenicist, and
I think,
all of this
stuff.
We
missed a step here, though, is that mainstream scientists and academics would actually have to accept this thesis or hypothesis. Maybe they could they could test it. They have the resources to do that. We don't. And if they did, yes, then we could have that discussion on whether or not population differences have implications on policy and policy design. But once again, I think we're just not there yet. Which I would not say that they shouldn't. I based on the evidence that I can see and what I can understand, there probably would be policy implications. I'm not smart enough or knowledgeable enough to know exactly what those are. But that's why I'm kind of hesitant to go say what specific policies there should be. I mean, you could I suppose in theory you could use historical standards. So, for example, the United States in 1924 introduced certain immigration quotas. Most immigrants had to be basically of Northwestern European stock, and there were stricter limitations on people from other part of Europe as well as other places in the world. And you could argue, all writers would certainly argue that worked for quite some time until the Nationality Act of Immigration. I might be butchering the exact title, of 1965, which got rid of all of those quotas and everything changed. You can look on a graph and to see how the demographics of the United States changes after that. Were things better back then? Well, probably definitely for white people, or they had more of a sense of community, and there was more of a kind of monoculture of a sort. But it's always a question of perspective. If you're a minority who did not belong to that Northwestern European group, then I guess things are better now, in some sense. But it's It's just a matter of perspective. I think one thing that seems to be pretty clear, unfortunately, is that if European people don't care about themselves, I don't think anyone else will. That's kind of something that seems to be the trend.
Yeah, there does seem to be enough evidence pointing towards that being the case. I suppose once you consider all of this, then, well, it does go back to the entire point of doing this. Does a people, I mean, not just individuals, but does a cultural group, a genetic group, whether you want to accept that culture comes from genes or from nothing, either way, you're still, I think, looking at a similar thing. Does it have a right to its own self-preservation? Does it have a right to some sense of self, and to then some sense of location attached to that self?
I mean, not inherently, but
should it? And that I think this is the kind of point.
Well, I think it's hypocritical. I've just been mulling over. It's if some group of people say they have a right to exist and a right to maintain their culture or their genes or whatever mishmash of that you want to advocate for, and they say this is really good, but this other group doesn't. I mean, there's incongruity in that argumentation. Now, that might be beneficial to the group to say that because they're competing for resources, but I think, if anything, generally speaking, the people in the alt-right, I'm not alt-right, but I do listen to them sometimes, say that, no, all groups should exist or have a right to exist. Whether they argue that's an inherent right or not, I think it's obvious it's not an inherent right, because that's no more inherent than the Brontosaurus' right to exist, but it went extinct. But I think that they would argue that. But it's strange that other groups of people don't argue for the group of, say, distinct European populations to exist long term. At best they'll bring up demographics of how it's not that bad, but I don't get the impression from someone like Cenk Uygur or Anna Kasparian of the Young Old Turks that they'd be particularly sad if European descended Americans became a huge minority. In fact, I don't want to get too much of a tangent, but it's interesting because there was this guy named David Shaver, I think. David Shaver. They finally released the videotape footage, happened a year ago. These officers engaged in some pretty questionable activity. Some white guy, he was a bit drunk. They basically murdered him.
Yeah, I've actually seen that cam footage. That was just...
It was murder.
Yeah, it really was.
It was murder.
The number of contradictory statements. It's like, put your hands in the air.
The guy said, please don't shoot me. Please,
Yeah, the one thing which I didn't get was, the guy...
Why didn't they order him to turn around to see if he had a firearm?
Yeah, or anything like that. I suppose some people have made the case, the door was open, they didn't know if there was someone waiting there to gun them down.
Who was really at fault? The commanding officer. I think his name was Langley. Apparently he's quietly gone to retirement. I mean, the shooter, the police officer... In any event, there's never been there's no real public outrage about this. Why? Well, he's not black. You better bet your bottom dollar. If that guy had been black, then...
just non-white, I would say.
Yeah, any non-white designation, and there would have been a huge issue. But clearly it was police misconduct and whatever. But that's a separate issue. That's a whole, discussion for another time. I mean, it's just an example of people don't really care about when bad things happen to white people. People generally don't give a shit. And, so it's up to probably if people want to maintain whiteness, then they probably have to look after their own interests, which will be opposed by people who don't see it that way. I mean, this is the whole question, I think, above all, of American identity that a good year or two have just put to question, what does it mean to be an American? I've met over the internet a lot of European Americans like myself who've left or went back to the old country because there's just something about the United States that isn't, there's no kind of sense of soil there. Now, I don't know, if I had grown up in a different era, would it have given me that sense of soil? I don't know, but it's possible. And now, given the trajectory of things, it's just impossible to capture that. I mean, these are open questions, but I fear that the mainstream, the public, public authorities, even if they want to grapple with these questions, it'll come far too late. I mean, people don't like when I say this, but I think Europe is done. I think Great Britain is done. Unless, and I'm not advocating this, just want to say this clearly, I'm not advocating violence, but I don't see any policy way around this, because public policy makers don't even acknowledge the possibilities we're willing to entertain. And I think both Celia and I, we're not sure about this. We think it's probable, right? That's my view.
Yeah, well, I said this in my video about thoughts about a peaceful religion. It's, I frankly see it as being somewhat an inevitable. It's like I don't really want it to happen, but until people are actually even willing to put it on the table, what's going to happen? The tension is just going to build and build and build. It's like we're on this course, we're on the course to go over a waterfall. Shall we change course? Nah. I mean, the fact that you've pointed that out, I mean, you're just waterfallist.
You're
Why do you hate gravity so much?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the direction it's going. I mean, basically, long term, Europe, and I'm not advocating for this, but if European cultures and peoples want to maintain any sense of, maintain their identity, just maintain their existence, because that's what we're talking about. I don't see this happening without some kind of pushback of some sort. You can't just roll over and die. I mean, clearly, because that's not going to lead anywhere.
Well, that's the thing. It's like this is the right to exist, or just the will to exist. So does Europe even have a will to continue existing? Well, I mean, frankly, I would agree that all the signs point to no so far.
Well, the will is not there. It's pretty much gone. The will hasn't been there. I've mentioned this a couple of times. I think that Europe in particular suffers from, in my view, a kind of historical weariness, or a war weariness. Centuries and centuries of conflict. 20th century is just the worst of them all, but 18th century had the Napoleonic Wars. You had the Franco-Prussian War, and then you go further back, you had the wars of religion, the 30 Years' War, which was basically a war of religion. The internecine conflicts between countries, the Netherlands and Spain, the mercantile. I mean, it just never really ends. It just doesn't. Maybe it's just a kind of collective shrugging of the shoulders and saying, we're done. We're done fighting. We've made mistakes, we've made positive contributions, but at the end of the day, we're just done fighting. Whether that fighting takes the form of legislation or not, So I don't know. That's my impression.
It's interesting that it comes back around to how we started. Interesting how that happened. It's like, Europe is just generally not violent anymore or aggressive in any way, and it really, I think, if it wanted to continue its existence as it is, then I kind of see it as being necessary that it would have to become more, not even confrontational, but just more actually open to the idea of protecting itself in some sort of capacity to continue its own existence. And it sort of seems to me like if you've got all of these other cultures. Whether we want to differentiate it as culture or genetic population, I don't really care. Frankly, it's immaterial at this point. But when you've got those groups which are, in some cases, quite open in their hostility towards Europe as a nation, or Europe as a series of nations, just the West as a group, it seems like the only then way to deal with that is to respond on the same level. Like, I know that a lot of people who do this sort of go down the hyper-individualist line. No, it's just down to individuals. If you want to try and preserve something, you go ahead and do it. But when you're, an individual standing against, an army on the opposite side, like a shield wall almost, and you're just one guy with a sword, like, well, I showed up. Great, you're going to lose because there is a more concerted effort on one side as opposed to the other side, which to me just leads to one very clear victor.
This was a point that Karen Strawn brought up a while back, some hypothetical scenario where everything's going to shit and white people are being threatened. Well, her kids are white and her relatives are white, and so she said, she sort of de facto she would band together with that group. Millennial Woes actually made a video about that. But I think she also made it clear that she doesn't want it to come to that. And she also said that she'd prefer a kind of white majority society where minorities are protected to a white minority society where no one is protected. Which I think, is basically where we're heading long term, probably. In the United States at least, or maybe Canada. In Europe, fuck if I know. Well, in Europe, there's a much bigger Muslim problem in Europe than there is in the States. The States have other problems, but you could argue you could get a Muslim majority throughout Europe that would, offer protection and benefits to Muslims, and then other people could pay the jizya or whatever. But I don't know. That's maybe an optimistic, I guess.
Yeah, assuming they even allowed that, which you never know, they might do because it's part of the religion, but yeah, okay. At that point, you're not really protected. You're paying the mob for protection. It's not really protection, is it?
Yeah. It's. It's just a racket. That's always been a racket.
Yeah. So in that circumstance, and this is, I think, is again part of the problem that in some ways, Western, whether you want to call it culture or a genetic thing or both, or I don't care. It really makes no particular difference. This idea of sort of wanting to be above the idea of saying, well, we exist here and we have a right to exist, and well, we're going to do something about it. Like, it's bizarre that there seems to be this idea that like you have to be above that kind of base behavior. It's like, is it really a base behavior to care about your continued existence?
Well,
I wouldn't say so.
No, and the hypocrisy is that other groups are conceded that right. I mean, I think it's kind of inevitable that it would come to this, but the state of Israel, everyone always talks about the right of Israel's existence. Now, barring the silly argument that things have an inherent right to exist, they maintain a Jewish majority with a decent sized Arab minority population. But no one, I think, in the framework of Israel, whether you want to argue it's cultural or an ethnicity, it doesn't matter, would argue that it would be good if the majority culture or people or whatever were replaced. But that's not what you see in other countries in the West. Well, it's not really a Western country, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, Israel is an example of an ethno-state. I always kind of give it a bit of side-eye when people say that. It's like, no, it's a Jewish state. It's a theocratic state. You have representatives from the three great races: Caucasoids, Negroids, and Mongoloids in Israel. Yeah, the only thing that ties them together is the religious aspect. Yeah, so it's the idea of being an ethno-state is kind of not.
This touches upon your point, though, that it's also, in some sense, immaterial. But the point is, nobody, whether it's a Chinese Jew or an Ethiopian Jew or a European Jew, None of these people, very few, I would argue, yeah, it's great. Let Islam take over. It'll be really great. Let's remove the Jewish character from the state. So I think that's something that's, you don't hear arguments like that in Europe. I mean, arguably, the Central European countries have been doing better. Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, the so-called Visegrad countries. But, I mean, they have their own issues, but they've been very adamant about not allowing these things to happen there. A lot of that's to do with the Cold War and their shared history, though. Western Europe's had it too good. I've said this many times. Sort of coasting by the last couple of decades. Lots of bread, lots of steak, welfare, pensions, great. No hardship. Another argument, when you don't have hardship for a long time, you forget how to deal with it.
Yeah, well, that one is very true.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
I think that might also then be part of the problem. It's maybe even if the will to preserve Western culture was there, like there's actually nothing to back it up.
I think this is likely. Because you look at the Visegrad nations, and they're very, they're just cognizant of having to deal with communism and all the struggles that entailed and involved, and they just don't want. They remember there were problems, and in some sense, they even remember the Ottoman problems back in the day. It's a very sort of distant memory. Western Europe, on the other hand. When is the last time Western Europe actually had to deal with serious problems from outside? We're talking the 8th century. Sure, there was lots of conflict between Europeans. I'm not denying that. But as far as a kind of almost otherly cultural force, yeah, it's been over 1,000 years. Well,
yeah, I think the closest thing to that would have been National Socialist Germany, which was the only time a European country took a really proper social deviation from the rest of it.
Yeah.
But it's nothing on the scale of.
But even then,
of certain other things.
Even then, I'm not a Hitler apologist. I don't think he was a great guy. But even then, he had this weird notion. Well, it's not even that weird, Well, he wanted to be nice to the English people because he considered them kin. And Churchill wasn't really a fan of that. But, still, the point is that the Western Europe, as a rule, has never really been under fire, or never, for a very long time, it's not been under fire. And Eastern Europe, Central Europe has had to deal with so much crap because it was, it's always been at the crossroads of Asia and Europe. Well, it's basically, it's that, well, the precise divide is different, but, whether it's Turkic hordes or other people, it always had to deal with that. So, yeah, it's something I think that, I can't help but be pessimistic about the prospects of things. I don't see any pushback. And it's funny that there's an irony that so many people don't even want to think of violence, but they're endorsing policies and moving in a direction where violence seems almost an inevitability. There are basically two options. Europeans will just roll over and die quietly, or they won't. And if they don't, there's going to be violence. And the violence will be directed in many different directions, and it will be a mess. And I think, if we thought no, I don't think the proportions, it's just that, I don't want to make predictions, but I do think those are the two options that we see in front of us. The people will either just lie down and die, or they will be very visceral in their resistance. I'm moving, in terms of predictions, I think more of the former. I think most people just lie down and die.
Well, that certainly does seem to be the way, just because it's mainstream, and the fact that things like the alt-right, whether you want to call them a bunch of racist neo-Nazis and whatnot, I think that label is largely undeserved for a lot of them. But just the non-stop demonizing of basically the only political group at the moment which is kind of saying, hey, Europe, you've got a good thing going, you want to maybe keep doing it because it's awesome, perhaps? It's just the massive demonization of seemingly the only group that might actually stand to do something just speaks very ill, I think, for the future. But you never know, maybe it will catch on, maybe there will be a resurgence of some sort of national identity, whether it goes right down to individual nations or some sort of collective European ethnic identity or something like that. I don't know, but I suppose in some ways the hope is that does happen, because then Western civilization will be able to continue. But I think if that happens, then I think it ends in some sort of violence either way. It's just a case of which way will minimize it.
Yeah. As I said, those seem to be the two possibilities down the road. I don't. Unless policymakers wake up or even care, or just don't see anything changing. Yeah, it's
kind of a shame, because I would really rather that Europe continues to exist and do things, because, hey, it is the best culture in the world, and frankly, it should continue to exist. And I think that it's kind of a shame that a lot of people seem to be shamed by the idea of acknowledging that and accepting that. It's like, why should you be ashamed of saying, like, yeah, no, our culture is amazing? Like, look at it. It's given the world basically everything that it has right now.
I can say, don't need to be, overly passionate about emotional. I mean, yeah. I mean, my thing is, why I seem, apart from the evidence, to come down on side is, I just don't think that an Islamic civilization is going to be moving, CRISPR technology forward, or working on better energy sources for the future, or any of these things that sort of scientifically driven discoveries that I think are important for the species. They don't even teach evolution in many of these countries. So, it's another element there. You could argue, and that's the thing, you could argue it's part of the Western tradition. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. I mean, there are different ways you could argue for that, but I don't see a Muslim takeover of Europe as being beneficial for that. So.
No, I think if you wanted to consider it more, even just from a global ecological standpoint, the existence of Europe, either as cultural identity or as genetic identity, again, frankly, I think the distinction is more or less immaterial until the conversation is on a much larger level and people are actually willing to engage with it. It seems to be a necessity. It does seem like all of the energy friendly or environmentally friendly energy and all of the big efforts in recyclable, reusable things seems to be largely coming from Western Europe. So if you want to live in a world that actually is a world you can live in, it would seem like it has to continue.
Yeah.
I mean, whether a country like China will do what Europe did, because Europe went through the really bad stage of not caring as much during like the Industrial Revolution, but then kind of after that, we're sort of hitting it now, like, oh yeah, we really should be doing something about it. Whether China might have a similar, waking up or enlightenment or something like that in another 50, 60 years, who knows? But that's the only sort of thing time would tell.
Yeah. But for people living in the present, I mean, there's not much reason to be optimistic.
Well, yeah, because otherwise it's like, the parent like trying to tell the child, learn from my mistakes, and the child's still going ahead and making the mistakes anyway. It's like, since we know this, why don't we just skip making the mistake in the first place?
Yeah. It's, I find it baffling and mind-boggling. I don't really. I just don't know how this is possible. But it has come to pass. Europe is standing on the brink of annihilation. And
yeah, I would say so, definitely, in some capacity. I would agree. Like, even if you just wanted to say, oh, it's purely cultural or it is a genetic thing, it's something's
whatever,
going to happen.
Cultural annihilation, genetic, I don't really, I mean, I just know that I can walk a few hundred, maybe even 100 meters away from my building, and there's a giant ugly mosque that I can see inside with the lovely crescent moons protruding out beyond the trees past the park. I mean, I don't see. I guess it's one thing I find really strange too is that you'll hear politicians argue for the benefit of immigrants for as labor force, right? Economic benefits, right? You'll hear that all the time. I never heard anyone say the benefit of Islam in Europe. Maybe I'm missing something. Nobody ever argues for that because they know there's no benefit. Nobody says that.
Well, I still find it funny people argue for the economic thing. It's like, let's bring in loads of people, which means wages will be depressed, which means people will earn less money. Where is the benefit? I mean, I'm not seeing it. I admit I'm not an economist, but that seems to be how things go. You flood a job market, those jobs are undervalued, and everyone is worse off. So there's less money, more demand for housing, which means the price goes up. I fail to see any upside to that. I know the argument that people make is just, oh, well, they do jobs that other people don't want to do. It's like, well, does that mean that we should be filling them? I mean, there's going to be a load of low-skilled jobs, basic carrying and harvesting jobs and things like that, which are going to be automated in the next 50 years anyway, so...
No.
Why bother importing the labor to do things which are going to become redundant anyway?
Or as Douglas Murray points out, immigrants get old too.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, I don't know. Speaking of Douglas Murray, it's kind of, if anyone, well, I guess he would be sort of laughed out of the room, but he talks about some of these things, but he never really brings up the things we talk about, and he edges on it. So, you know Douglas Murray, right?
I know the name. That's kind of about it.
Ah, okay. Yeah, he's big on. Yeah, he wrote this book, The Strange Death of Europe. It's pretty decent, and he talks about some of these things. Never really talks about the nitty-gritty details. Some of the things we talked about, but
well, how many people will? I think that's the
politically
question.
Correct. Even the skeptics won't talk about it.
Well, they're just the politically correct, friendly face of the counterculture. This is why I think they're having a lot of discord with the alt-right now, because it's like, oh, we're edgy, but we're not that edgy. That's the bad kind of edgy. Unfortunately, the bad kind of edgy at the moment seems to be the kind of edgy that's making inroads into things that might actually result in changing things for the better. Perhaps. Yeah.
I mean, there is, of course, I should say, and I've said this publicly, privately, that I do have concerns, with a kind of alt-right structure. I think that at the moment we suffer from a particular type of tyranny, but I don't really trust either side ultimately. I think that the pendulum is such that, so there's a lot of work that's been done by this psychologist Jonathan Haidt in the States, and he talks about liberal traits, the sort of balance of openness, trade openness is a good thing in some sense, and the kind of guardedness and protective nature of the conservative is also being good, and the fusion of that is creating not an optimal, but a kind of better society where the strengths of both worldviews are emphasized and stressed. And I fear that, we've gone, absolutely nutty with the sort of trade openness. liberal side of things, and if it were to swing all the way in the other direction, it would be a different type of nuttiness that arguably could potentially be even more dangerous.
Oh, potentially. Well, this is the thing. This is why we, so many elections between left and right are often fairly closely fought, because it's about half and half of the populations. And that I think has been balanced for the longest time and has really sort of quite worked to the advantage of things, because it allows for a coarse self-correction over a number of years.
Yeah.
We do live in an environment now, I would say, where the idea of trait openness is the most glorified thing in the world. Like it's, and the idea of low openness is now the most demonized thing imaginable. I mean, I've even experienced that on a personal thing. Like I'm quite low on trait openness. I like things as they are, and new things, we can have a little bit of them, but just a little bit at a time. It's a good thing, but not too much.
Yeah, I'm somewhere in between you and the standard position these days, but yeah.
Yeah, so, and then, like, the number of people, like, I've especially found it online from, again, certain communities. I don't like constantly going back to it, but it always seems to come back there somehow. Basically just like, oh, you're not as open to new things and as agreeable as we are on everything, therefore you're a bad person. And it's like, well, that's a lovely value judgment you've got there. Too bad it means absolutely nothing.
Well, I mean, that's a dilemma these days with the left. I mean, that is the mantra: trade openness and being accepting and just open to everything. That's we've just gone topsy-turvy. Hey, hell, what do I know? You might even know a need a spiraling towards the far right to correct that, to get back to a balance where a society can actually move forward, benefiting from both traits. But yeah,
I think it's actually somewhat a necessity, but well, considering I'm more of that mindset anyway myself, of course I'd say.
But my worry with that is that one of the things about one of the extreme ends of the conservative is sort of disgust.
Yeah, and that is where it becomes a real problem.
Yeah, that's what we saw during World War II, and well, basically any time there's that kind of thing, it's kind of a concern potentially. But then again, as things are now, they can't continue. So I'm pretty centrist about a lot of things, I guess, and so I'm sort of hesitant to really. I don't want to back up either side. I'd like a nice tug of war where the best of both sides can kind of inform the landscape, but it doesn't seem to be happening. So.
I don't think it's going to. Like the more and more polarized things are getting, and that is what's happening. Things are becoming more and more polarized because there is one side that I think has such a discrepancy of power and is so adamant on holding on to it and never even allowing the other side to have any sort of validity at all. And I think that's really causing the problem. It's like even moderates now are classed as the extremist if you're moderate in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Well, right. That's why this guy, Jonathan Haidt, professor at NYU, created the so-called heterodox academy. Different people, different views, mostly academics, left, right, in the middle, etc. I mean, you have a society that's too closed off to new ideas, it can never develop and never grow. You have a society that's too open, it cannibalizes itself like we're seeing now. So probably need a little bit of both, or a lot of both, or whatever, but we don't need only one thing. And right now we have only one thing.
Yeah, we need a kind of continuous struggle wending our way between the two.
Yeah.
That seems to work. Like if you didn't have people pulling one way and didn't have people pulling the other, you'd end up. I think both sides, just when they reach a certain critical mass of either side, just ends up in total destruction. I think it's just which side is going to cause the destruction, and this time it seems to be the left side completely that's going to level everything. Unless the right side pulls too hard.
Well,
who knows? We're now in the case of trying to predict the future, and that never goes very well.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we can just acknowledge that the current situation, direction things are going is not good, and increasingly I just feel that I can talk about this till I'm blue in the face, but unless it becomes a matter of actual public discourse, what's the point?
Well, it's fun.
It's fun. Well, I definitely like talking about the sort of the more sciencey, sciencey stuff, scientific stuff. The relationship of culture to genes, and maybe in time.
Careful, otherwise you're going to become the new alt-right science man.
No,
you never know.
No, I'm excited. I'm just too much of a centrist and too much of an individualist to ever call myself alt-right. This is my point I have to make. You can concede points they make. I can concede points the left makes too on occasion. I don't need to take a side entirely and say, hey, I'm all for this side and everything else that comes my way is wrong. That's what happened. I mean, briefly to touch upon Urban Tea, that's what happened with his stuff. He just said, I'm gonna dig in my boots and I'm not gonna retract anything or move or budge at all, and that's what happened.
And then he died. More or less, somewhat.
Well,
metaphorically.
Metaphorically, for sure. It's definitely a possibility that, if he continues down this route, that something like that might happen.
Oh, well, in the name of progress, some people just have to go. Voluntarily or not.
Possibly, but I my frustration with the skeptic community in general, apart from, things that are obvious, is that because they have a kind of larger portal greater access to the mainstream, they could be saying things that are important, that are relevant, but they don't.
Well, when are you going to have time to talk about important things when it's that time of the week where you have to have here's stupid things I found on the internet?
Yeah, you're making a video about that, but that's, I get that. That's a separate issue. I get the sense that even a guy like Sargon, he thinks it's all just a joke. I'm not joking when I'm talking about this stuff. I've seen Germany in the past 10 years, although I wasn't living here the entire 10 years, but off and on I've witnessed it. It's transformed. And every year it gets worse. So, it's not really a joke. Well, I guess if you find that funny, I guess it is a joke, but I don't. I've been called a humorless cad, though, so maybe that's it. Still, I just, social justice, whatever, I mean, these are not joking matters anymore. We're really getting to a critical point where if we don't do something horrible is going to happen one way or another. We, the people, especially in Europe. I think the United States has other issues that are related but separate. But Europe, whether it's Great Britain or the continent, all of Western Europe, has to really consider the seriousness of what's going on.
Yeah. I think the thing is too many people are just content to stick their head in the sand and say, well, it's not that bad. No, it really is. Like, you need to very seriously start considering
I'll grant
what
you
you want to
this.
do.
And my impression, because I used to I had a sort of gaming group, and there's some Dutch people in there, and they seem, as long as they have what they need, they're fine. Well, I would argue you can probably keep on having that, but if you have interference in your daily life, let's say you want to move from A to B, and you want to take your Me phone with you or whatever gadget, and you want to go to work, and that becomes troubling and difficult because there's crime or risk, then it's not no more easy life. It really is that bad, and I think everyone who lives in Europe should be concerned about this. Above all, the so-called moderate Muslims, or ones who don't even have an attachment to it. No, but I don't see people being overly concerned. I made a video about this. I just think that as long as people have their needs met, they don't get concerned about these larger issues, and I think that's their mistake.
I think it's because a lot of people kind of lack any concept of something bigger than themselves, and I think this is actually ties quite nicely back to the idea of, states and their right to exist and whatnot. Like, the idea of a state, it only really comes from a time when a group of individuals is willing to sacrifice something about their individuality for some sort of greater idea. That the idea that a sum of all of them as their parts becomes greater than that of any individual. And I think that's a sense which a lot of people are lacking. Yeah. It's, I mean, even if you take really mundane examples, about, say, rates of recycling, it's really boring, really mundane. It's putting stuff in a box for it to be carted off and to be reused somewhere versus the amount that goes in a plastic bag and goes to a landfill. Like, the number of people who just don't bother, even though it's like the easiest thing in the world to do. And obviously I have a slight reason for being annoyed with this, because I'm one of those people who's just like, no, everything will be reused in some way. Mm-hmm. I'm the person, it's like, Pringles can, that bit goes in the plastic, I'm going to sit with a can opener and take the metal bottom off so that can go in a different thing.
I can't talk to you anymore. I can't talk to you anymore. You eat Pringles, you fucking pleb. All the organic crisps out there, you eat Pringles. That's shameful. I know. I am the worst person ever, but I couldn't help myself. There was a sweet chili flavor, and I was like, I gotta try me some of those. I'm not gonna lie, it can taste pretty good. Yeah, that's true.
Exactly. Also, I had people over, so I have my defense there.
Fair enough.
It wasn't purely me.
You've been exonerated from your sins. You're allowed to go forth into the world.
Excellent. But I'm one of those people. But the number of people who are not, they just don't care, like, in any way. Like, the number of times I've seen people, I'm just be walking around and you'll see people, just drink out of a drinks can and they'll just chuck it off a bridge into a river. Just don't care. Yeah.
I'm not that obsessed with recycling, but I would never do that.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen so many people do it, and I think it's just because, they have no sense of the world bigger than themselves. It's like they're too focused on themselves, and as long as they've got the things that they want, that they need, fuck everything else almost. It's like it never occurs to them that an action like that will come around and bite them in the arse. It's like the idea that, in 20 or 30 years, they can be, well, even right now, they can be tucking into a piece of fish, and they're getting however many, milligrams or micrograms of plastic in with it, because the plankton ate it once it broke down, and then fish ate that, and then fish ate that, and fish ate that. They just have no sense of something or idea that they could be a part of something greater than themselves, and I think that's, in many ways, kind of a shame. But then that also then comes into this idea of, does a people have an identity, and does that identity need to exist? And, you don't even need to be part of a people or something like that, but just the idea of you being part of a greater thing.
Yeah,
it just lacks in any capacity.
I don't consider myself part of a people, but I do strongly advocate for what I've coined sort of pan-Europeanism, sort of pan-European identity. Because I think it has value. It has produced good scientific traditions and good literary traditions and decent societies to live in, and
yeah, and so it's like, you want it to continue to exist, and so you do your own part to do that. Like, even if it's something quite small, like, well, run a YouTube channel. Put out videos, talk about it. You're continuing that in some capacity. Now, whether you want to say that it's an altruistic thing, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. There might be an element of it to it. I know there is for what I do, but It's like, yeah, I want people to hear these ideas, to share in this and see if something good comes of it.
Yeah.
It's contributing to something that is greater than just my own interest.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I suppose that's all we can do as individuals, contributing to the greater good, the big project of saving Europe from itself in some sense.
Yeah, and so if you considered it in that light, it's not like you have to then become some sort of, uber chest thumping, this identity, this thing. It's like, no, I'm just going to contribute in my own tiny way, which, even if you then wanted to say, oh, well, you're just being an individualist, then, you're not caring about the collective whole. It's like, well, no, I do. Because that's why I do what I do. Because I want, I'm not just content to sit and, while away my own existence and, hey, nonny, that's it. I want something that I do to have some sort of meaning or impact on something that is greater than myself. And, given the fact that I am all in on, hey, Western culture, let's get that and continue it. If we can expand it, well, that would be nice, I think. Go for it.
Yeah, I'm down with that. Although, like I said, increasingly I just feel a sense of futility. It's kind of, to draw a comic analogy, with Superman and Krypton dying, it just feels like I'm living in a dying world that just doesn't give a shit. And with some, with the pleasures interspersed, sure, but an enjoyment, but I actually have much. My view is that, I'm all down with this, and yet I see this still as just kind of hopefully a building block to something greater, where we can really start moving past our human limitations. We were talking about this before. We can't do that if we have to deal with immigration problems and demographic problems, and it's pretty annoying. Guess first things first.
Yeah, so you just have to kind of try in some way to move past those things. But this is, I suppose, harkens back to something I said earlier. It's not good enough, I think, to simply hold yourself, aloof of the things and just say, well, I, the individualist, do not think that we should attempt in any way to have some sort of collective ideal or some sort of, it doesn't even have to go full collectivism, because I think that's one thing which scares a lot of people. You talk about, this group of people or this culture or this idea, this way of life, something like that, and it instantly becomes, oh, you're being a collectivist. It's, no, I'm not, because I still recognize that all of these people are individuals. They have individual differences, individual preferences, tastes. Yeah, sure they do. But that doesn't mean that I don't want to encourage a certain pattern of behavior. I can recognize that those people are individuals while still wanting those individuals, or, trying to encourage those individuals to express a certain pattern of behavior which would be more beneficial, because it would result in, their preservation as opposed to their out-and-out destruction. But then, I suppose, again, it's one of the other annoyances that I find is, if you do that, where is the line between, the inevitable angry people in the comments section going, oh, you're just preaching. You just want everyone to do what you want to do. Just stop preaching at people. Stop trying to convert people, and all of this sort of stuff. It's like, well, where is the line between, being authoritarian and, wanting or trying to be a totalitarian about it, and wanting, demanding that people observe this pattern of behavior, to just sharing information? What is the difference between the two? Because it seems like these days, even if you just want to share a piece of information or just consider it, so much of what we've done in the stream hasn't even been, this is what I think, everyone should do this. It's just, if we wanted to consider this from this angle, and if we wanted to consider this from this angle, it's not even stating things in fact. So, at what point does it just become ideas to becoming, there's this preaching thing that then people, or some people hate, and then it's like, well, even if you wanted to try and define that line, is it then wrong to share a good idea? Even if someone doesn't want to hear a good idea, is it then wrong for you to even try? I wouldn't say so.
Yeah, no. I guess I just feel that so much of YouTube, internet doesn't really penetrate the public sphere in the way it should, because there are a lot of bad ideas, but there are a lot of good ideas, and there are actually people trying to figure out the truth of things. And you don't hear any of this in the mainstream, though. So,
I just think that it doesn't have a lot of widespread appeal.
Well, I agree. I know why it doesn't have a lot of widespread appeal, but put it this way: if some of these ideas had the same gravity as gravity, no pun intended, they would be paying attention.
Yeah, they would. This is why I think it's inevitable that it will come to the public forefront at some point. And, well, it'll just be past the boiling point when it does, so that's why it's going to kind of explode. But, I think also I may hold a very unpopular opinion in this point, but I will put it out there anyway, that I think a lot of people are just too stupid to actually understand or know what's good for them in these circumstances.
No doubt. I mean, there are people chugging down liters of Coke. Not Diet Coke, mind you, but Coke. And it's not good for them, but they're doing it anyway.
Yeah. But then, and again, this is one of the frustrating arguments which I hear against this, and it becomes off like the person is arguing like a 12-year-old, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, where you'll say something like, it would be preferable if people were to do this. And even if you've just said it, it's like purely suggestion or something like that, you inevitably get the response of, oh, so you think that everyone should necessarily do this? I bet you don't do this. It's like, it's almost like they seem to think that in order for you to suggest that something could be done because it's beneficial, you must be the perfect man before you can say that. It's like, you point out that someone made a mistake somewhere. It's like, oh, so you think you're the best person ever, the smartest person in the field. It's like, no, not even like, why do I have to be the best person at the thing before I'm allowed to offer an idea or an improvement on something?
Yeah,
it's like that's ridiculous. It just doesn't work. Like, world records would never be broken if that was the case. It's like, oh, here's a weightlifting coach. Oh, you can't lift as much as me, so you can't tell me how to improve my form. It's like, well, no, they can, because they actually know more than you about it. Just because they can't outperform you, that doesn't mean that they can't advise.
Yeah. But such is the I made a joke once a couple of weeks ago. Some Greek guy said, "Oh, this word is derived from the Greek," and I made this joke. I said, "Well, scatology and scatos shit is also derived from the Greek," and he just started ranting at me how I'm a racist and how Germany will fall even though it was just insane. Yeah, people are weird on the internet.
I think in some ways you just end up getting exposed to more stupid people, frankly.
Yeah, who take themselves very, very seriously. Not talking about crowd here, by the way.
I have to wonder if there's a degree of insecurity involved with some of those people, though. It's like, oh, you said something funny. Fuck you. You're the worst person ever. Oh, clearly you think you're the best, and screw you. It's, wow. Do you have something that's like not really going your way in life? Like, are you really insecure about something? Because that reaction was really disproportionate.
Yeah. I don't know. I just want to learn stuff and understand stuff. So, yeah, that's my view.
Yeah, well, ditto, but I would also rather that get out to wider...
Oh, yeah, for
to
sure.
wider
I'm
society.
not saying I don't want to keep it. In fact, it's pretty... I don't actually like keeping it to myself. But yeah, absolutely.
And that I think is then the push. It's, can these ideas be pushed out into a mainstream point where they will become at least something that people are willing to even listen to, as opposed to simply knee-jerking and shouting, racist, all of that other sort of stupid stuff before even hearing the idea.
Yeah.
I suppose the comment section on this video will be very enlightening. How many people are just, oh, you've gone full alt-right this time, you racist Nazi apologist, derp, and various other face rolling on the keyboard noises.
Yeah.
It'll be very telling, the number of that compared to actual considerations of, well, people do have a right to exist because XYZ, or as this other point over here, here's a source.
I think that a lot of the people will lean in the alt-right direction anyway, and the ones that don't will they won't watch. I don't know. I think this has been this kind of purity spiral thing, by the way. This affected MGTOW. There's a lot of people that don't consider, I don't really care, don't consider me part of that or whatever. It's happening in the alt-right. I think there's a lot of purity spiraling. I don't think people are interested in ideas and discussing them per se, so much as maintaining the purity of their clique. But yeah, I hope this conversation is kind of useful to people, or they think about some of these things, and yeah, I think maybe they can over family dinner bring these topics up and talk about them.
Wouldn't that just be the ideal world where something like that could actually happen?
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure if we're going to get there anytime soon, but well, you never know.
So, people, everyone here, do you think that we need to preserve the white race? That's an icebreaker and a half. How can we assure the future for white children?
But there are even greater concerns. I'm sure you paid attention. The video game world is falling apart too.
Yeah.
Every AAA company is just shit these days. Well, pretty much. What's left?
Indie games, lots and lots of indie games,
precisely,
which are better than the AAA games, frankly, in a lot of cases.
One wonders what they could do with better funding, but yeah, it's...
Well, then they'll become the AAA titles, which are then boxed into their tiny niche, because you need to have the most mass appeal, so you've got to slowly water things down, and then they'll be replaced with another generation of indie creators.
I suppose.
I have to wonder if that would be the cyclical nature of it. I mean, I kind of hope that it doesn't, because I like the fact that there's a lot of smaller studios producing all of these weird things.
But it's hard, because it's kind of looking back to the greatness of things. BioWare put out a lot of great games back in the day, but yeah, it's kind of that time is done.
Well, I think there may also be perhaps these slight political messages slipping into video games these days is part of a problem with that. I mean, I can't believe in Germany, the new Wolfenstein game was censored. It's like, oh, this might trigger some people. You're literally killing the people that the current populace doesn't like.
Yeah, I don't know too many of the details on that. I mean, is it they're killing actual Nazis or just random white people?
No, you're doing the same thing. It's pew pew, dead Nazis, head collisions, all that stuff. But apparently we have to censor out the Nazi thing, because why? What, you might upset Nazis? I didn't think that was a concern of yours. Just mentioning the fact that Nazis did exist at some point might trigger some people. What? I really don't understand the move to it. It's like, no, just accept this is a thing in history. It happened. Just get over it.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you start denying certain elements of history, it's like, what's the phrase? You know, he who does not learn from history is bound to repeat it.
Yeah.
Something along those lines. I just, that's how I see it. It's like, when you want to start rewriting history, you're going to start screwing things up. It's like, even around popular things, you know, like the Crusades, you know, it was the evil white Christian patriarchy attacking and oppressing the poor brown people. Was it? Because from my understanding of it, it was a retaliation for some 500 years of Islamic piracy and general barbarism all along European coastlines. You know, abduction, murder, rape, stealing people for the slave trade, and then finally Europe was like, you know what? A strong defense is a good offense. Let's go.
Yeah.
But you'll never be told that.
Yeah, well, yeah, they're indie companies still. That's what I can still cling to. Those indie companies.
From Crusades to indie companies.
Crusader Kings too. No, it's Paradox Games. I don't know if you play those ground strategy games. I'm trying to get into them.
I did play Stellaris. It was pretty good.
Oh yeah.
I haven't got any of the expansion packs or anything. I kind of like rage quit that a little bit because they were like, you know what, we're going to remove embassies, because I'd kind of expanded my empire between two of the giant, you know, galactic endgame things, which usually ignore you because they're like they've researched everything, got maximum everything. They're like ancient races, and I'd popped my civilization in between that. Had obviously embassies in each one of them, so they liked me. And then they patched embassies out of the game, and suddenly I had two giant mega empires who were like 10 million tech levels ahead of me just suddenly collapse in on me because they were like, yeah, we don't like you being this close to our borders now. I kind of rage quit at that point.
Somebody pointed out, by the way, in that game, Stellaris, a while back, that the best way to, you know, get a good thing going is just to kill everybody and basically create an ethno-state. I haven't played the game, but I'm not. By the way, I am not suggesting we do that. Just
we're talking about video games now, not
but in the game Stellaris, if you want to, you know, get a good thing going, eliminate all the competition, be really racist, and yeah.
Yeah, see, I tried that approach. It actually worked really well for the start of the game. The problem is, because you've like spent so much money on being very expansionist, you tend to end up behind in technology for some of the other civilizations I've found. And then because they're all, you know, forming alliances and all of that sort of stuff, it's like, well, if I want to take you out, I'm actually taking on like 4 or 5 other people at once. I really can't afford to do that. So you get a really good explosive start, and then you just kind of hit a wall. Because at that point you're still, while you are bigger than other things, they've all clustered together, and you can't really necessarily break in very easily. That's what I found anyway.
Well, I have not really played the game. It's one of those games I own, but I've never, like so many Steam games.
Yeah. I tried it. I did go full Space Hitler.
Nice.
It worked very, very well until they patched out embassies. That was a real problem. Because then my strategy failed spectacularly, because the 2 people who were at my back were suddenly didn't like me anymore, and problems abound.
Those problems, aliens, embassies.
This is why I don't like, you know, video games these days, patching and changing game mechanics. It's great in some ways, but in other ways it can really screw you over like that. You remember back in the day when you bought a game and it was on a CD or a cartridge or a DVD, and that was the game you got?
Yeah, I do. But it's a long time ago.
Yeah, and often the games actually worked, as opposed to being released not working. What a time to be alive it was.
Yep. Good old days.
Like, half of this game doesn't work. Day one DLC, that'll fix it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much potential in the indie market. I'm just hoping that the old school gamers decide, hey, let's just put more money into this so we can get good games. I pledged to Pillars of Eternity 2 because I like Obsidian generally. Tyrannies, if you haven't played that, I don't know if you like isometric RPGs. Tyranny is actually legitimately really good. Short enough to get through it and short enough to do another replay. Obsidian game, by the way. And that maybe instead of working 4 or 5 million budgets, we could get to the point where they have 25, where they could really just start doing lots of cool stuff that only mainstream companies with mainstream budgets have access to. I don't know. It's an idea I have, a hope, a dream.
Like so many things.
Like so many things, like Europe not.
But do people have the will?
Strangely enough, I have more hope for the indie game industry than I do for Western civilization. So, arguably there won't be an indie game industry if Western civilization goes under. So, there's it too.
Yeah, it is true. How many? We'd have to rely basically entirely on Japan then for video games.
Yeah, I'm not too obsessed with the Japanese. I mean, I like some, but I like the Western video games. Chauvinist that way.
Yeah, Japan is all right, but they have a thing for schoolgirls and tentacles, and I kind of lose interest at that point.
Yeah. Same. All right, on that note, I think that's been an interesting talk. I hope the audience finds it interesting, and food for thought if you've never chewed on that food before, and if you've already chewed on it, I guess, I don't know, more food for thought, maybe, possibly.
You can never have too much of that.
Yeah, never have too much.
In before alt-right dog whistle, Nazi sympathizer, white supremacists.
Maybe.
Just a few predictions for things that will be said.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I'm kind of up in the air about how the comment section will be, but I suppose. See, I'm much smaller than you, but I have. To be honest, not that I'm alt-right, but I know I have a bunch of alt-right subscribers. So it's your channel still has a lot of people who are, you could say in the skeptic community. So those accusations might be thrown at you more often than they're thrown at me.
I don't know. They seem to take it easier when I go into it usually because I just back it up with loads of evidence. It's kind of like, you can't really argue against this, and this is why a lot of the times when I've had people try to argue it, it's often just like snarling at a name or something like that, which is ridiculous. Like talking about like R and K selection theory and like K factors and how that's going into fast and slow life history theories, and people just saying, this you cited this person. Clearly you don't know anything about the topic. You're just wrong. It's like, I mean, if you know so much about that topic, instead of typing a snarky, condescending sentence like that, you could have just typed a sentence which said, this person has been cited, this is the error with their idea. So rather than just this, self-falating, I'm just so much better than you, in fact, I'm so much better than you and so much smarter than you, I don't even need to explain why. Like, instead of doing that, you could have actually offered some piece of information, but you didn't. Which leads me to conclude, you don't have that information. Bye-bye.
You gotta pick and choose your battles on the internet. There's no doubt about that.
I just find most people aren't actually interested in addressing the topic. They're more just interested in trying to make themselves sound really smart and enlightened while not engaging at all.
Yeah, start a fight, that's another one.
Yeah, it's really annoying. One of my favorite ones, whenever you see a sentence, this is something I've learned, just whenever you see or hear a sentence that begins with, so you think the next words are going to be a complete lie, or something so absurd that it doesn't even bear addressing.
Yeah, it's very rare I bother with comment sections. I mean, either they're just nice comments, or just observations, or they're just absurd comments that don't really make sense. Like, that guy accused me of racism against Greeks because I said that scatology was derived from Greek. Okay. Yeah.
You mad, bro.
Yeah, I'm...
There comes a time where that is the only response that you need.
You mad, bro? Okay,
like,
man.
You sound upset.
It's all good, bro. Just have a sip of beer and calm down, bro. It's all good. Yeah. Yeah, but the comment sections are just cancer.
Yes, I generally avoid them as well because of that.
Yeah, definitely. Anyway, we've been talking for a while. Officially for over 2.5 hours. Unofficially for over 3 hours. Any final points? Come on, guys. Everyone make an effort to save Western civilization in your own way. I could say that. Support indie companies that you like. Create pushback against AAA companies because they suck these days. And try to avoid sugar, or at least limit your sugar intake. Those are 3 things I can endorse.
Yep, they're pretty good. I would just say, yep, Western civilization, awesome. Do something to preserve it because it deserves it. Always recycle, and yeah, make sure you go outside. Get that sunlight. Vitamin D, very important.
If you're suffering, if you're in a shortage on that, you can supplement, but you probably want to get it naturally as well.
Yeah, fresh air, exercise, all that good stuff.
Yeah, and then you're on your way to becoming a shining paragon of heroism, and you'll be the savior, maybe.
Yes, you will be the white savior of the world.
Indeed. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. And we will check you out later. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.